Welcome to the YouTube channel for the HR M&A Roundtable. I'm Dr. Clint Kendrick, chair of the HR M&A Roundtable and author of the HR Practitioner's Guide to Mergers and Acquisitions Due Diligence. The HR M&A Roundtable is a forum for practitioners teaching practitioners how people, leadership, and culture drive M&A deal value. We provide a variety of opportunities for HR M&A practitioners to connect with one another, including an annual conference, webinars, a Women in HR M&A mastermind group, and of course, roundtables. I started the HR M&A Roundtable because peer learning is an invaluable resource, especially if you're new to the HR M&A space. As an experienced practitioner and HR M&A leader at a Fortune 500 company, I continue to rely on the Roundtable to stay up to date with the latest trends and thinking in HR M&A. You can learn more about the HR M&A Roundtable by visiting www.mdaroundtable.com, where you can find information on our organization and the many resources we provide for HR M&A practitioners. While you're there, sign up for our mailing list so you can stay informed about our upcoming events.
Thank you so much, and thanks to everybody for letting me pour it into your kitchen, living room, dining room, wherever I may be coming into in these times. What I thought I would share is a little bit of how we in the consortium, the group I run, the Connected Commons, a lot of the member companies are using these network analytic ideas in different kinds of merger and acquisition situations. So I'll describe a couple where there were very big merger, scenarios and implications of that from a retention strategy, from more efficient integration at points that matter. But I also want to talk a little bit about where a lot of them are starting to deploy a set of tools, looking at the smaller acquisition strategies of 50, 100, 200 person organizations, being brought into these places to complement different capabilities there. And the way I want to do it is really twofold, and I want to kind of walk you through this notion of, if you had a network perspective on these acquisitions, what would it let you see and do differently at a group level? And then I'm going to pause, and we're going to put everybody into a breakout room and kind of have you brainstorm for a few minutes and come back to me and just reflect a little bit on the applications of this for you. And at that point, I'd really love to hear, people kind of pull and probe on the ideas. I've worked with over 300 organizations. We've run the analytics over 1,000 times in the past little over 2 decades. And so that's, where I can hopefully kind of pinpoint down on things you all are thinking about. And then depending on how time goes, I'd like to drop down a layer and say, well, what if you could more effectively speed inclusion of the individuals, and think about how do you do that from a network standpoint again. And this is based on about 15 years of work we've been studying in another program in the consortia on people that come in and replicate the connectivity of high performers much more rapidly, and what they're doing to make that happen. So to get us started, though, I just want to use an example. This is drawn from one of my earlier books. Real live example. This is a 7,000 person organization within a major petrochemical firm, and they were losing a tremendous amount of money in the deep sea drilling area because they weren't able to move best practices well across platforms, right? So I was at IBM still at the time, and they were throwing knowledge management systems and technologies at it right and left. And it wasn't having, the effect on decreasing the performance gap between the most effective and least effective platforms, basically. And they said, what if we looked at the network, right? Not ways that people are acquiring technology, because most people, when they have a problem, and even today, they're much more likely to reach out into their network to find information, get decisions, get expertise, get ideas. And they said, what if we could make that visible and take a look at it? And so we went out and looked at the group. Now, the real group, again, was about 7,000 people. And I'll go, into this in chunks. I didn't want to start with a big, analytic exercise. But what you start to see when you look at just a high-level representation of the group and the network, on the left side, the formal structure, what we're used to using is a map of what's happening in the organization, who has influence, who matters. And then on the right, there's a network where there's a line between two people. If one or the other said, this is a really critical source of information for me to get my work done. Now, there's a lot of ways, especially today, we can get that. I'll show you a survey tool in a little bit. You can obviously mine kind of electronic communication, calendaring data, co-staffing matrices. There's all sorts of ways you can do it. But for right now, let's just say we're looking at a survey-based generated network of who's turning to whom for information. And you intuitively start to get the sense of the things that it helps you see. One, every single network analysis I've done, where we're looking at groups of a couple thousand up to 60, 70,000 people in an organization, we can expect 3 to 5% of the people to account for 20 to 35% of the value-added collaborations in these places. Of course, there's never just one Mitchell, right? There's usually hundreds of them distributed through the network. But what's most interesting about it is that if I compare my list of who the Mitchells are against the company's list, and these are all very sophisticated firms, in terms of who they think is important, right? Who's in the top talent programs or high potentials or getting promoted the most rapidly. If I compare my list against their list, usually there's less than a 50% overlap, right? And so one thing you immediately care about if you're acquiring an entity is understanding who those Mitchells are that you're missing, right? Because when they leave, and you know there's a high departure rate in most acquisitions, it's not just the capabilities they walk out the door with, it's the way they're disrupting work. And quite honestly, what we can see in our attrition models is the way that snowball attrition around them happens, particularly if one person's a strong energizer. The odds of the people connected to them around them leaving in the next time period goes up pretty significantly. So a couple of reasons you care about, who are these central people that you're not often as aware of as we like to think. Second, very focused in a lot of our work on understanding who are the people on the fringe of the network. And so what we can usually see in most places, except for some very rapid biotech startups recently and some software startups, is it generally takes people about 3 to 5 years to come in and replicate the connectivity of a high performer in most organizations. Doesn't mean they're not connected. It means they have not come in and replicated the pattern of bridging ties, trusted relationships, reputational capital that makes a high performer able to scale what they're doing, right? The connective aspect of what they're doing. And yet what we've seen is that there are people that come into these places and do the same thing, not in 3 to 5 years, but in 9 months. And we've studied the heck out of that, right? To really understand what are these people doing that is creating this much more rapid inclusion, much more rapid impact. And of course, you care about that in an acquisition scenario because you want to be able to equip people, right, with how best to kind of navigate or move into a new culture, depending on that context and what they're doing. So I'll come back to that in terms of some of the practices and what we're doing. And the third is we always care where the silos are, right? I'm never, ever saying to anybody in this game that you just want more people connected to more people, right? Because if I asked how many people on this call wanted another email meeting or, phone call, Zoom call in your lives, not too many hands shoot up, right? But what we do care about is where those collaborations are breaking down, where you're expecting some kind of value add, right? And in this case, the production division had simply moved up 2 floors in a building, and it had broken down all the hallway coordination they'd been relying on to get work done. And this is a wildly expensive proposition, high fixed asset cost structure where they were churning, $3-4 million a day. And so those decision delays actually were quite expensive, right? And that's usually what we're looking for in the merger situations, is saying either where are you expecting people to come together to give you scale or market, breadth, or where are you expecting innovation potential, and they're not interacting, right, in ways you want. And then the idea is you don't go back and just hold a big meeting. You start being very targeted in how and where you bring people together across those lines. We also, are really interested in, as you think about driving a change in bringing people in any kind of merger that I've been involved with, where the different committees are set up to do different aspects of the change process, who you pick and put on that committee can really have an impact on uptake, right? And a lot of times, we're grabbing our favorites. Sometimes they're overwhelmed already, and it slows things down. When a lot of times what you really want to find are the Zahirs, the Schultzes, the McWaters, the people that are kind of second-tier connectors in the thick of how things are happening. We know if you pick them, you tend to get much greater uptake and transfer, whether it's a cultural change or a kind of implementation group that you're focused on. One of the pieces of work that we've done that I'd also want to queue up for you is a lot of times people say, an acquisition or a merger fails because of culture, right? 2 different cultures in organizations. And so we've done a lot of work where we are actually including culture data with the network analysis assessment. And so, traditionally you go do these culture surveys and it's you get a standard score of say 4 on a scale of 1 to 5, and you can parse that by legacy organization, or you can look at levels or divisions or whatever, but it's not all that meaningful when you see a score of 4, right? And actually what we're finding is when we distribute those scores on the network, right? If we actually ask the network analysis questions and the culture assessment questions, you actually quite often don't get fours. You actually have pockets of threes and fives. And what it's enabling organizations to see is how do we leverage and pull on the stories of the fives and propagate those? How do we remove obstacles from the areas where the threes are happening? The other thing that I'm sure everybody's intuitively experienced is you find that, especially in merger situations, people that are most for and against a given trajectory or a given value, right? They're competing because one group likes the science of what they're doing, another the market potential. They tend to be dead center in the network, right? And so they may agree in a room, but then be going out and pulling in different directions. But when you can see that and where those friction points are happening, you can do a lot of things to bring groups together. So I can point people to this paper. It's a recent piece we did on looking at culture through this relational lens that's had a lot of uptake, even at a basic level of if you identify when we've had offsites, the number of times I'd be in a top, team offsite for different organizations, and the more, progressive ones, more hierarchical ones, let me say, just brought the top team and maybe the next layer down. The more progressive ones, they would bring the top team next layer down and maybe people they thought really mattered, right, in the organization because they were going to try and make it inclusive. But every time we did that and we had the network analysis, we would look and see, okay, of the people you picked to be in this room, how many are you actually touching? How effective are you? And kind of agreeing on what the culture should be and transferring it out into the network. And we find that usually if they pick through the network analysis, if they pick the influencers, right, deep in the organization, you literally would double your impact in every single case that we've done this. And so you think about kind of how you start running the meetings, who you're including, who you're involving earlier. It gives you much greater uptake to be driving change through this way. So let me show you one more thing. I want to make it live for a situation, and then I'm going to put you into a breakout room and ask you to come along and play a little bit and come back and talk to me for a second. So this is one of the tools we built in the consortium to be able to look at these networks very rapidly. The members have been, pushing me for this for some time to say we need a very rapid way of looking at groups, let's say in the 8 to 2,000 person range, and seeing how they're working together. Now, this happened to be an organization that had recently been a merger of equals, and they had, by virtue of coming together, had an ability to go after the market in a different way, in ways that they believed would double the size of the enterprise, right, over time. So this is it was a merged, roughly 10,000 person organization. They thought they could go to 20 and diversify their markets. And so they, as they came together, new CEO really said this commercialization effort and the new innovation abilities we have here is the thing that's going to set us on the stage. And they brought 64 of the best and brightest from around the organization to really put the collective intellect into how to go to market, right? And so everything you could imagine was thrown at this thing. Resources, executive support, they went out, this is pre-COVID, they went into the woods, into the vision building things, and IDEO processes, and you name it, right? Everything you can think of. And yet 9 months in, it just hadn't moved, right? And there was a lot of reasons for this in terms of people agreeing in the room and going off and pulling in their directions, people not making enough time for it, not coming through on commitments. There was almost a war between the sales substream and the research substream in the program. And so the person that had been put in charge of this group decided to go get a job elsewhere. And this is somebody that had been with that firm, the first firm, 10 years, superstar in that organization, but she knew that this was going to be something that she was stuck with, right, for a while and left. And a new person was being brought in to try and save the day. Another person, very successful track record in this organization, but she had no idea what she was inheriting with this 64. And she was hearing all sorts of different stories. The departing project manager was saying that, the marketing stream's complaining a lot. I don't get it. The CEO was saying, you need to rely more on this person, this person, this person, because they're the only ones getting things done. Executive team saying we have to do a program relaunch and bring everybody together and get them all on the same page. And she wasn't quite sure about that, or if just doing more of the same would breed cynicism. And then she had internal people in the group that she knew were muttering that she got picked versus them, and was trying to figure out kind of, how to think about them, how to get, uptake from them. So, very simple. What she did was go out and run a quick network analysis through this toolkit. And let me make sure that everybody can see the network analysis. Can somebody just give me a thumbs up if they see the network diagram here? I want to make sure we're transferring over well, or Just
We
say,
sure can, Rob.
got it. Okay, good deal. So real simple approach, right? Leaders come in, this is a guided tool that they just make a few decisions. They upload the names and emails of people in the group they want to look at, hit a go button. And then in this case, in I think it was 10 days, she set the interval on. It came back and she had the ability to see who's turning to whom for information in this group. The dots reflect the key people in the network. The lines reflect who's reaching to whom. If you have a lot of arrows coming in, that means you're heavily sought. A lot of arrows going out means you're heavily seeking. And you can imagine, just as an incoming leader in something like this, it really started to quickly help her get a sense of, okay, who matters most, and who are the most connected people in this group, and why do I care, right? What do I need to think about with those individuals? Why do they matter? How do people kind of work either through them to drive change, or in ways that help avoid collaborative overload, and different impacts there. She was able to really quickly go in and see what's going on with marketing and sales. So I'm just going to grab those two, and I'll take out the product development substream and kind of take a look at, what that intersection point looked like in the network. And so it'll redraw pretty quickly here. And you just start to get a sense of the ability for her to see where she had opportunities to bring specific people together, right? And rather than do a massive program relaunch, think about, how do I staff key people in different ways that are going to bring them in contact with each other. If she'd done a program relaunch, a lot of times what that'll do is just kind of continue to breed cynicism, right, in different ways, and keep the underlying subsets of what's happening from working together. And also gave her a chance to look at other things very quickly within the group. So she could start to get a sense of this silo locator that we have here, which is showing where do you have breakdowns in collaboration within this group. So obviously as groups get bigger, the network diagrams are harder and harder to see. So we use these analytics to understand where connectivity is higher or lower than you might expect. You can look at it by function, by location, by any number of things. And then where you see junctures in these networks that really matter, that you care about, you can kind of open up that intersection point and start to look at the connectivity of the people at that juncture. And again, think about, okay, is it one person that I need to find ways to bring together, or ways to integrate the group more effectively? Obviously, in a merger situation, what we're also doing is looking at it from the standpoint of the legacy substreams that you're trying to get together. And usually what you're doing is isolating out who are the 5 most connected people on this side, the 5 most connected on that side, and look for ways to bring them together in work streams. And quite often it's not the same people that you're picking from the formal structure. I mean, that's been always the real eye opener for people, is I'll ask leaders in most cases to guess ahead of time and tell me who are the top 10, top 20 most connected people in your group. And then I'll show them this graph right here, where now we're looking at the most connected people in the network. Deborah George is sought out by 25 other people, Crystal Barber by 24. And invariably when I do this, people will guess ahead of time, where they'll give me their top talent list, and you'll generally get the first 2 or 3 right. And then you're surprised at number 4, 7, 10 to 12. You go down the list and it isolates out a very substantial set of people that people hadn't been thinking about, right? So we always are focused on that, and always also looking at who are the people that create energy in the group. So energy for me is another question that we always ask around not just information flow we're looking at in these diagrams, but we'll also map this question of, when you interact with this person, how does it affect your enthusiasm? Do you walk away more enthused, less enthused? And we find that if you can find this energy idea, it has outpredicted everything over 23 years of doing this. It outpredicts who becomes and stays a high performer. It outpredicts where innovation is happening in these networks. And it's very behavioral. And you know it intuitively, right? When you can get somebody that's highly influential in a group and somebody that creates enthusiasm. That doesn't mean they're a cheerleader, doesn't mean they're an extrovert, just means that they are able to create followership by how they engage. You get much, much greater effect, right? And so you start thinking about, where is energy low in people that I'm concerned about because they have good influence in the network, and then where is it high from people that I want to get on to design teams, implementation teams. Then the last thing I'll show here, and then I want to push this into a quick breakout discussion, is this collaborative overload score, because this is what far, far too often I see kills the mergers that we've seen, right? It's not uncommon for me to see, as I said before, 3 to 5% of the people to account for 20 to 35% of the value-added collaborations in most places. And in situations of large-scale change, that number ratchets up even higher, and mainly on the middle manager level, right? And it starts to create a fantastic bottleneck on those individuals. So the overload score is measuring the number of times that somebody is being sought for information, and the people in their network is saying, I have to have more of their time to be able to hit my goals, right? And so you see Gary Shelton here. These are all disguised names, obviously. Most overloaded person in the group. When this number goes beyond about 25%, we see the individuals start to burn out, and the people around them, oftentimes their departure rate goes up. And the interesting thing here, if you remember from the beginning slide and the setup slide, is Gary Shelton was who the CEO was telling this incoming leader she needed to give more work to, right? And it's the common thing, if you find the busy person and they're just, getting put more and more on them, and the old people don't stop coming to them. So when she looked at this, she talked to Gary and found out, after a coffee, that he was actually looking for another job. He was beyond capacity and it had it. And I see that a tremendous amount now. Used to be our attrition models were, if it was not getting connected quickly enough, that predicted departures. And now it's very bimodal today, right? It's not getting connected enough, but more and more we're also seeing these people that get just flat out so overwhelmed with demands that they'll choose to leave and kind of go another route. Now, seeing that, what they were able to do is partition different demands that were coming at him. And he actually did end up taking on that work stream, but in a way that was sustainable, right? And kind of was ultimately successful there. So I won't kind of keep walking through the analytics here, because I do mainly just want to give a sense of these ideas and their strength, right? And being able to think about the network connectivity in a given organization. And I'll ask everybody as you go off to break to kind of think about these two questions in your subgroups. We'll give you about 3 or 4 minutes, and then I'd love to hear 1 or 2 ideas. I may cold call because I'm a professor, so be ready for that. But I would put this in perspective and just reflect for a moment on the amount of time you spend each week on the phone, on email, or in meetings, virtual or face-to-face. And then ask yourself, how are you managing that time in your organizations, right? How are you managing that network? So for most places, that's about 85% of people's time is in collaborative activities like that. And we're really good at looking at the human capital as individuals. Most places don't factor in this work, even though it's grown to represent, a phenomenal portion of our time. So Brenda, with that, I'm going to give it to you and see if we can put people into breakout groups for 5 minutes and then come back. Is that okay?
Yep. Okay. So this is, I've only done this a couple times, so I apologize if you don't get into a breakout room, but I'm hoping that this works. So here we go.
We have faith.
We have faith. There we go. Open all rooms. Is it working?
It is. People are starting to go into their rooms, Brenda.
Okay, Clint, I think you don't have to join. That's how you would work it. But
Yeah.
Olga is in a room with you and Rob. So I'm going to see if I can reassign her.
Yeah, that's probably good.
Room 1. There we go.
And apologize to Olga for us.
So 44 seconds. Sorry, guys. I didn't realize it gave him another minute.
Yeah, no, you're doing fine. We're all doing great.
And it always seems to take a few minutes to bring folks out of those rooms as well into the main room. So it'll take another minute or 2 to populate.
Yeah. But it's good that we're learning this tool, huh, Clint?
Yeah.
Okay, it looks like some people are starting to come back.
Right, I see people coming back. So somebody's going to have to come off mute and talk to me here in a minute. I see names. I see people hiding from me now.
I was gonna say, the minute you say that, everybody goes off camera.
Right. So I'd love to hear, as people come back in, I'll just kind of mention one thing that Clint and I were talking about kind of off camera, was the question around email analytics, or kind of passive analytics, and the sources that people are using. And we used both in the consortium, right? We focused in different ways. I think at the heart of it, there's some phenomenal strengths of what you see that will come more and more from what Microsoft has, right? They've acquired Volumetric. Volumetric then became Workplace Analytics, and now it's going into the new employee experience application. But it also comes at some really difficult things in terms of privacy. I would have thought email analytics would have been much further along in terms of the uptake in my consortia, and I'm finding more and more survey-based approaches are actually far more utilized than I would have thought because of privacy implications, especially in Europe. And then secondarily, it's actually harder than you might think to interpret the meaning of an email-based network, even though it's seductively easy to get. What you can't really see a lot of times is if the 50 exchanges we've had is, some sort of decision processing, chain around an approval, or it's that one interaction that closes the deal. And so what we've tended to do more and more in an M&A front is, one opening survey, and this might be, I'll show you some groups in a minute where we looked at the top 10,000 of places, big mergers, and then follow it with kind of monthly email polls where everything's disguised, and you're just looking to see, are we getting the integration that we'd counted on across certain points in those networks, and if not, kind of delving in a little bit further. But with that being said, I'd love to hear from people if they wouldn't mind going off mute and just kind of sharing an idea or question or concern, anything like that. I'd love to see if we could get engagement from one or two people there.
I'll take the risk.
All right, Brandon, because I can outwait long, uncomfortable silences like nobody you've ever seen.
I'm impressed already. I had the chance to meet Olga. Really interesting discussion about how this can be used to maybe understand the culture that you actually have instead of the culture that you want. And some of our experiences, I was really unaware of how of the tools. I'm pretty excited about what you've shown me and the ability to see it. There was always a desire to do this and to identify opinion leaders and people of influence, but the ability to see it, the kind of condition monitoring, if you will, is really valuable. So I want to definitely know more about that.
Cool. Cool. Good. Well, thank you. And yeah, on the culture side, like that's been one of our biggest, focal points in one of these tracks in the consortium is, I find that culture is far more local than we think. Like our how we measure it tends to, miss us, have us miss a lot. You either use surveys or you may do ethnographies, but you get these central tendencies when we overlay this stuff on the network. You find that it's a lot more localized in interactions, and it just gives you a different chance to kind of see how to pull on it. Another cool thing we've done in the past, when you mentioned about what the culture is actually like, is we'll actually use a network question to say who most reflects, the desired culture here. And so then the networks are pointing to who the cultural opinion leaders are, and then go interview them and see kind of what are you doing? How do we get you into these ambassador programs or any kind of emergent bottom-up processes? What's funny to me is a lot of times I'm in these top leader forums and I'll show the network analytics and their eyes always light up because they're thinking, now I know who the influencers are and I can tell them what to go think. You know what I mean? I can diffuse down through them, and that's a piece of it. But the more you can also use these ideas to say, how do we want to be pulling the stories out that people are most excited about, right? Or think about kind of emergent, sides of it can be pretty cool as well. All right, give me one more. Don't make me call out there. I see Ellen and Dave and people that are hiding from me.
This is Kim. I am going to stay off video, so you don't have to see my.
All right. Okay.
I got a chance to talk to Ellen and another Kim. So a great day to have a name like Kim. But I think to me too, my eyes lit up when I was seeing this because I think there are so many different ways that, this gives you data, like working at an engineering company, people do like that data,
Right.
and kind of put some kind of teeth behind some of the cultural stuff that when we look at cultural due diligence and like look through some of that. So I thought that was interesting. And I know some of the other things brought up in our group was, how do we even look at this if there are like, if we're looking at layoffs or rifts, or, if we're, really looking at the right teams there. And another thing just that I resonated with was the collaboration fatigue. I just find that fascinating. Just as a M&A practitioner, we kind of encounter that, but how does like our teams internally and the companies that we're purchasing, integrating, like I feel like they go through so much of that. So to have that data, to be conscious in how we're managing it, just I thought was a great use as well.
Very cool. Yeah. So I'll grab two thoughts there, and then I'll keep us going. I won't keep picking on people, but thank you guys for playing along here. One is the layoff thing, and I never, everybody, when we're in a down cycle, which we haven't been in a while, people would always approach me and say, can we use O&A to find out who to let go? And I'm immediately shying away from that, just because there's a lot of reasons people may be in a given position in the network. But I have, had people in situations where an acquiring company is, having to make some decisions around where redundancies are or whatever, and then look at this data at the end of that, and they'll dramatically change their opinions, right? They were picking people that had a much greater effect than they had realized. And so I do think it's, it's a piece of it that can be helpful. Or you think about maybe not the actual layoffs, but who you're giving your retention bonuses to, right? And typically it's oftentimes missed in pretty significant ways, in who really matters, right? Who kind of, pulls the groups together there. So, and then the overload piece, we've done a lot of work. I'm not covering that today, but I've that's really the focus of my next book. Is we've studied the heck out of these people that give the greatest impact in these networks and take the least amount of time. Analytically, we can see they're about 18 to 24% more efficient than just average in the networks. So that's about a day a week, if you add it up. And so we've really focused on a whole suite of tools that help people think about not how do they dump people out of their network, but what are the practices of the most efficient collaborators, right? How can they engage in that and do things a little bit differently? It's also one of the things that the overload really crushes acquisitions I've seen, or large mergers. If you're in a company that's moving into agile, it's another problem right now that I'm seeing in a lot of my consortium members, because the Scrum teams get staffed, and we're usually picking top of mind. And so we take the Gary Sheltons, right, the already busy people, and move them over. And what happens in that is you're pulling people out of existing streams of work that are highly influential, and then putting them over here, and their old network doesn't stop coming to them, right? So you end up kind of disrupting streams of work over here and overwhelming an individual that ends up over here, even though the consultants are saying, oh, no, they're not staffed there anymore. They still have to answer, right, and help, their colleagues. So what we're seeing with the analytics, and I didn't get the chance to kind of go into this as much, is it's not that you don't do these shifts, but you look for your second tier connectors, and you find ways to kind of grab the people that aren't top of mind and use them as a development, trajectory, so that you're not overwhelming the center. There's very kind of cool ways you can manage that overload, and it's very tactical. It's not just an abstract idea. So let me push ahead. I've only got I was targeting to end here in 50 minutes. So I want to give us one more chance to look at something, and possibly do a quick breakout here at the individual level. This is, obviously this is a 10,000 person group, right? Obviously when it gets big, the network analytics as diagrams aren't that helpful. That's where you see me going into things like I showed you with those heat maps that let us see the certain junctures that we care about, or the scorecard views, or we use these bubble charts to see where overload is happening or lack of integration, things like that. But this is an example of what I was describing earlier, is you can kind of parse into this specific network analysis and start to see who's overwhelmed. And in this case, it was typically the middle layers of the organization. And how do you kind of shift demands off of them? But also, they were able to use that heat map view and see where is cross-legacy integration happening well. And this happened to be a big merger, multi-billion-dollar merger, right? And so what we were doing there was saying, what are the points of value that we anticipate to be deriving from this, and then plotting out, where those cross legacy ties were happening across units. This is obviously disguised, you parse it in different ways. And then where it's low, like unit F, you're looking at the network at that juncture and saying, if this is an intersection that we care about, how do we kind of take the well-connected people on either side and bring them together? Other ideas on culture, I've already mentioned this notion of one of the real common values that we get is by virtue of including culture data with the network analysis. And so here you're seeing a real common example where a small network of a much bigger group, where the people in the center are both the most positive and the most negative, right, on this given value. And it's a very common thing to see where this gets masked if you're looking at averages of culture data response. But when you actually look in there, you tend to find that your most influential people tend to be kind of pulling in different directions, right? And they, of course, affect others and causes problems there. And so when you can see that, there's different strategies for targeting integration. This was probably one of my favorite examples from a couple of years ago. It was a large company acquiring a middle-sized company for scientific innovation. And somebody at the company site, it was working with me on the O&A here. We were looking at their top several thousand in this case. And she went out and asked the top 40 leaders in this, acquired organization, what's the single most important priority for this merger to be successful, right? So out of 40 leaders asking what's the top priority, she got 18 different single most top priorities, right? Just out of 40. And we thought, okay, we asked the question wrong, right? In the way we were doing the interviews. So we put it in the survey and said, just pick which one of these 18 really is the single most important priority. And out of that, we got 12, right? Different priorities. And you get the idea, though, that what it allowed us to do is then overlay that on the network and see, where are people competing either on values, what they care about in the work, science versus revenue, or where incentive schemes are pulling, in ways that are going to kind of keep the group from, delivering the synergy of the outcome that you want. So there's a lot of opportunities at that level of the organization. And I want to just kind of share one more set of ideas. We probably won't do the breakout. We'll probably just go directly into Q&A if that's okay. But another thing that we're seeing a lot of the member companies and the consortium leverage are not just the full O&A analytics, but also work that we've done looking at talent mobility in networks. And so this started off, as I mentioned earlier, with a work where we were mapping network analyses and looking to see how long it would take people typically to come in and replicate the connectivity of a high performer. And what we found in there was quite often most strong culture companies, it took about 3 to 5 years, yet some people were doing it in 9 months, right? We're getting to that point where they were delivering value. And of course, they were much more productive, more early. They were much less likely to leave the organization. A lot of very positive things about them. And so we studied the heck out of what they're doing, right? In that time frame, what's different about how they were coming in that allowed them to, to become such an asset so much more quickly. And it was really fascinating, as we kind of isolated these people out, hundreds of interviews. And we found, for example, it's the game is not won in the first 30, 60, or 90 days, that this is roughly a 9-month process that people are tending to do a couple of things in that get them adapted into the network. And really interestingly, it's not one with some of the conventional wisdom. It's not one, for example, by coming in and going out and telling everybody what you do, right? Here's my experience, here's my expertise. Rather, what we were finding, the idea of build your brand, right? And go, communicate who you are and build relationships with the hierarchy and get wins on the board. What we're finding with the people that were much faster movers, they were just as likely to be reaching out broadly early, but it was a broader network that they tended to reach to and very specific kinds of people. And rather than go out and say, here's what I've done in the past, even if somebody asked them, they would turn the question around and say, no, before I talk about myself, tell me about your top priorities, right? What are you trying to accomplish, or your top challenges? And listen to that for a while and slowly morph their expertise to the incumbent's needs, give status, generate energy, and create a mutual win, right? So rather than kind of, market themselves or push themselves, not in an arrogant sense, but just what they're used to doing, these people were creating coal for themselves. They were situating their capabilities and the incumbents' needs. And it was one of a set of subtle but important practices that differentiated people that got connected in 9 months versus 3 to 5 years, right? And actually what we could see on a trajectory here is, somebody like a Nate that comes in and just does what conventionally you were told to do. They tend to surge early, but then they get out past about a year, and as work becomes larger and larger for them, they have trouble scaling themselves. People don't necessarily know them or trust them. They think they're in it for their own purposes. And whereas a Terry, if she's situating what she knows and others' needs, she tends to build trust more rapidly. Things start to flow to her, and people kind of go with her more quickly when she gets out to that kind of 15, 18-month time frame. And so the idea that we're seeing in this is that new entrants, they're kind of racing a clock to get through this 9 to 12-month window that we would see was the common kind of point of failure, right? The failure or the departure may not happen for 2 years sometimes, but we could kind of track it back and see that this is where, somebody like a Nate suddenly is getting a lot more, having to work a lot harder to get the same amount of something done versus Terry that's, kind of engaged with the network in a different way and is able to kind of scale through what she's doing. So when we add all, and, the interesting thing to me, and I don't know if you all will have seen this in your organizations with mergers, this is an area I'm super passionate about right now, is we tend to see scenarios where Nate, very successful to it, and then into this point, suddenly leaves in 2 years. And then oftentimes we'll actually not really even be able to pinpoint where things went wrong, and we'll recreate the mistake. I don't know if you've ever looked on LinkedIn and you see people that are in an organization for 12 to 15 years and then go on these 2-year runs across a bunch of places. And I'm somewhat convinced that it's this phenomenon going on, that they just can't recreate the success in some cases, right, of what they did before. So when we look at it, what we see is it's sets of things that people do in terms of who they initiate the connections with. We can see it's not just the formal leaders in your team that matters. It's a set of 5 kinds of connections early that matter, as an example. It's how they engage. So this idea of push versus pull, it it sounds obvious, but it isn't. It's not the first thing we do. The number of times, I'll run executives through this notion. I'll say, oh yeah, I know how to do pull, right? And get people interested in me. And then you put them in a fishbowl and they immediately flip into saying, let me tell you about what I do, and kind of justifying that. And in an acquired entity, when they're under pressure, that's what they're going to do, right? Especially if you're not doing things that kind of ease that off a little bit versus situating their capabilities and the needs, right? And taking a little longer. There's 12 of these ideas that we can see, and that they array kind of over the first 9 months. So these are just workbooks. I'm trying to make sure that you get a sense that there's a there. I'm not just talking about network analytics and the abstract, but there's sets of things that people are doing kind of over the first 9 months that have a big differentiator. And we've kind of built this out to be able to help people integrate more rapidly in the groups that they care about. These are all things you can take a look at on the Connected Commons site. There's a free diagnostic people can come in to take. The way I run the consortium is very much like an open source community. But what I'd urge you to look at is, as we formed this group, we could see that there were 4 different kinds of transitions that really acted differently, right? So you have the new hires, and you can imagine that as the larger body of people coming in through an acquisition. The senior leaders, right, where you may have to be making certain decisions around, one versus the other, but they needed certain kinds of treatment coming in. Promoted leaders, internal promotions, and then just lateral shifts, lateral transitions that are often happening. And as we looked at the community of organizations working with us on this, what we can see is that any given year, about 30 to 40% of any given organization's population is in one of these significant shifts. And so it really matters, right? You think if that's the case, and we could streamline that down, we could shave that down to a third or half of the time it takes to get productive. That's a really big win. But then the real win comes from if you remember that these people aren't atoms in isolation. right? That they actually affect the work of 5 or 6 others or more when they leave, and you start factoring that in, it has a real profound effect in terms of, streamlining entry. And the key idea behind it is that each path is different, right? We can see that, for example, the promoted leader, I'll take the incoming senior leader or the incoming new hire. The first thing they need to do is go broad early, right? And not just with the leaders and their team, but a peer group, people that support their work. There's a set of 5 specific connections that matter. A promoted leader, almost one of the first things they need to do is reduce collaborative overload. So one of the real problems we find with the internal promotions, it's very common for leaders to rise in an organization, continue to hold with 60, 70% of their ties back where they came from. And if they keep doing that, then it becomes a bias in their thinking, right? Or overwhelm, where they don't build an enterprise network that really matters there. So I would urge people to take a look at this, right? It's just a secondary way of saying, okay, for these groups that need to move in, are we equipping them to kind of come in and integrate as effectively as possible? So I had promised to end at 50 minutes, and we're right at 50 here. So instead of doing the breakout room, maybe I can put this up, or Brenda, Steve, I'll kind of follow your lead too. If you want me to go a different direction, we could do the breakout room here for a couple of minutes and then come back for discussion. So let me hand it over to you all to see whether we want to just go from here or go into a breakout room.
So this is Brenda. Clint, Steve, do you have any input? Should we go to a breakout room for a short period of time?
Yeah, there's another. I think we've got enough time to do that.
Okay, let's go ahead and do that. Okay, I'm going to recreate them and reassign people to different rooms so you get to know someone else. Okay, and open all rooms. Okay, thanks, Clint.
Yep.
So Rob, are you going to go through the questions, or do you want me to go through them?
Yeah, no, I have them open here, so I can do that. I'll just see quickly if people are being willing to be brave or not, and if not, I'll go.
Okay, good. So everybody should be back now.
Are we good? So any kind of quick thoughts? I won't badger Brandon or others right now, or Kim, but if there's anybody that had a thought, I'd love to hear it. Or if you think you're doing something particularly successful at the individual level in getting people integrated, or struggled in certain things, I'd love to hear any observations if you had a moment. Anybody bold and brave here?
I have got a question, more of an observation, but it might not be directly related to this.
That's perfect.
Yeah, so I was just talking to Brandon, and I was reflecting on, it's partly because this is front of mind because I'm working on an org design as part of a transformation in a pharmaceutical company at the moment. It's not an M&A, but similar components. One of the questions I had was, to what extent are certain individuals well networked? Is it driven by formal or informal reasons?
Right.
Are they, and could they be well networked because the capability that they have is under resourced within the organization? So they're a critical point of failure for some other reason that is not to do with their own efforts to develop their network. So it's kind of more of a HR perspective on analyzing something to resolve other problems and alleviate that stress on that person.
Yeah, it's a great question. So, and it's a really deep one. I'll never forget early on, Steve Kerr, when he was at Goldman, was saying, is it the role or the individual, right? Over and over again, and what's kind of driving it. And you're adding in the capability as a third possible element there, particularly in life sciences. We see that a tremendous amount where you have either a small set of those skills, or oddly enough, a lot of times you actually have 10 people with that skill, but everybody thinks you got to go to Joe or Susan, right? They're the ones that are legitimated. And so you can imagine that's a real problem, right? When you have Joe or Susan that are across 6 projects and they're actually working as hard as they can, but none of them are getting enough of it down and they're slowing things down. You can start to see that with these analytics, like where is that happening? So when we do that from an expertise standpoint, and then I'll come back to the role idea. What we're actually doing is setting assessments up in a way that says, please indicate the capabilities you most need to seek others out for help. And particularly in scientific settings like life sciences and engineering or whatever, they oftentimes have taxonomies, so you can kind of get to that pretty quickly. And then, so what do you most need help for, right? And then who do you turn to for those specific things? And it allows you to start to see what I'm saying, that a lot of times you actually have more talent in place, but the network coheres on a small set of people. And then you're trying to figure out, how do I distribute that, right? Bring some of these people with the legitimated person to meetings, do things that kind of take that off. Or if it's a capability that you've said, this is really important for us to be world-class at, you don't get world-class just by having the best experts, right? As individuals in individual silos, you get world-class by them also talking and kind of sharing what they're doing. And so it starts to let you see a little bit of that too, is, you know, are we really building the infrastructure that's going to let us either distinguish on that capability, or are we integrating that capability with an adjacent capability that could help us innovate? There's a lot, you know, of twists to that, but your point is dead on, right? There's a variable, you know, engagement on experts. Then the second piece to me that you mentioned is the role design thing. And this is one of the things that drives me crazy following all the consulting firms, is they will come in and they'll say, we're going to make you agile. And their only approach is to pick layers out of a hierarchy, right? Generally speaking, it's to go to spans and layers, or, you know, maybe try agile or something like that. And what it does invariably is it's not looking at the collaborative footprint of the work itself, right? And you know it yourself, if you're doing a redesign and you have task A on a board, you know, sticky note, and task B, but task A requires that person to work across functions, 2 time zones, and 3 people that don't like each other. That's totally different than somebody that just has to coordinate internally, yet it looks like the same time demand on the wall, you know what I mean? And so we're working a lot with the consortium members now, and it may have been you, Ellen, that was asking about the role overlay here, to really think about, you know, what is that collaborative footprint? When we do the network analytics, we're actually reflecting not just in those situations, we're saying, who do you turn to? And is it role driven? You know, is it decision approvals, resources, information that's privy to that person, or is it expertise driven, right? And you know, capability driven. And that starts to let us get a sense of kind of that idea, you know, is it formal structure that's causing our problems? So anyway, long answer, but it's a huge point of interest for me. Any other quick thoughts out there? Any bold, brave people? All right, so I don't see any takers here, so I'm going to start walking down. And I'd urge people to put their questions in the chat list. I'll try to read off what I see, and then hopefully hit people's questions. And please come off. I'm about the most unthreatening person in the world, so come and talk to me too. But Trevor said, can you talk about how would you identify these network surveys, tracking of e-transactions, et cetera? And definitely not too basic. And I should have said more about this. I just tend to not want to get down into the weeds. The tool that I showed you is something that we've developed through the consortium. It's a very efficient tool for doing O&A, and it's particularly targeting groups kind of 8 to 2,000 people, roughly. You know, I know that's a big variance, but it's not like designed for 20,000, 50,000 big engagement survey kinds of things. So that's one option, and you could send me an email on it. The people in the consortium have access to it. I think some of you all would already have access to it if I remember the member company list, because you're members of my group as well. But that takes about 10 minutes for leaders to set up, and about 10 minutes for people to take the assessment that's in the group that's being looked at. And the cool thing about that one is that it generates the dashboard, and I was only showing you a piece of that analytically to look at the group. But the really neat thing about network data is it has a value for each person in the network. It's helpful for me to know if I'm more or less connected than I should be, or if my network is more or less insular than it should be. So we create a report for each person in the assessment that gives them the ability to say, okay, here's what I need to do going forward. Now, those reports don't show anything private. It doesn't show that, you know, Ellen doesn't think I'm, you know, worth listening to or whatever. It just shows these sideways bar charts that are kind of giving people a relative degree of their connectivity, and then things that they could think about. Can also certainly use email analytics. I would have thought we would have done a lot more of that 10 years ago. I was telling Clint this earlier. But it's, number one, it's deceptively hard sometimes, especially when you're getting into discussions with top teams and you have these people saying, well, is 50 ties good or bad, right, on this email exchange, and you don't know, right? You can't answer that. Whereas the survey gives you the richness that you need. Now, what the email does bring a strength to is the overtime analytics, right? So if you're pulling monthly data pulls, you can start to get a sense of where are we calibrating the way that we want it to, groups integrating or overload happening, right? You can track and see where are we about to run into problems because of certain layers there. So I'd urge, certainly look at the Connected Commons site, shoot me an email and I can point you to, we run a quarterly class that we make available to everybody, a public good on these ideas and some of the more frequent tools we use. So if you drop me an email, I can make sure you get into that. It's, like I say, I run the group like a open source community as close as possible to that to make as much of it as available to everybody. So Ellen, interested in overlay. I think we got that, didn't we? Hopefully just now in that discussion. Stephanie says, are these 3-factor skills that are teachable or are they personality traits? So Stephanie, can you say more about that when you say the 3 factors?
Yeah, I posted the question when you had the slide up on the 3 factors that.
Oh, the fast movers.
Yes.
Yeah, I do believe there is some evidence that extroverts tend to reach more and introverts tend to be sought more when we overlay, the network analytics with different personality assessments. But in general, you're generally as likely to see an introvert as an extrovert in the center of these networks. They do it differently, right? But what the cool part of all this to me has been that we've been able to drive it down into specific behaviors and things that people can go do, right? And so, if you go out onto the Connected Commons website, you can see some of the tools that are built, and it's very, specific. And the real key is just being intentional about the right kinds of connections that tends to matter. Now, at the heart of it, you still have some people that are a little bit more comfortable than others reaching out, but I don't think it's an entrenched skill, if you will. And we have a lot of evidence for that it's certainly not a personality trait, though some might find it a little bit more comfortable than others.
Got it. So teachable skills is what you're saying.
Yeah,
Right.
very much. And most of it, what I find that really works, like if you kind of look at those sets of things, and I can send you a site, or Steve and everybody can here too. What really works is if you get people to come in and say, okay, you as the new person in my organization, we're going to have 3 meetings over the first 9 months, and likely you're going to do that anyway. But suddenly with these tools, the discussion is different, rather than somebody coming in and the entrenched leader saying, you need to go build a network. Networks really matter here. But then they're looking at each other, not quite sure who to connect. They're pulling out this table saying, okay, it's these 5 kinds of connections that distinguish people that do better. And let's build a game plan, together. That I find works really well, right? Then you've got this kind of, person with wisdom in the area that's helping the individual connect. And oddly enough, you find that the entrenched leaders, the incumbent leaders, really love it because they can help more. So it actually is a real win if you can embed the activities in a pair like that, right? Not just the individuals. That's where we seem to get a lot of success in this. Let's see. So a couple of people said they had to drop. Critical point of failure. Yeah. That's, happens to me all the time, where we're getting points in these networks where people are overwhelmed in different ways and they choose to leave versus stay. And so you can certainly see that. In part, you can see it by Ellen's comment around the expert or the key, individuals that everybody's turning to, or you can see it by virtue of other elements that we're looking at in the network. But it is a really common thing, is to think about the susceptibility there and what happens if you're not thinking about building in kind of redundancies behind the individual. So I think that gets everything that was in chat. And Clint,